The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of room 203, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors of Riverside High School. Michael Thompson sat at his desk, absently doodling in the margins of his notebook as other students filed into Mrs. Wells' American history class. It was just another Tuesday in October, or at least that's what he thought. The classroom had that familiar smell of chalk dust and old textbooks. Posters of historical figures lined the walls, their faces watching silently as Mrs. Wells strode in, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose. She wore her usual pressed blouse and pencil skirt, but something about her expression today made Michael's stomach tighten with unease. "Good morning, class," she announced, her voice carrying that artificial cheerfulness that teachers sometimes use when they're about to assign a major project. "Today, we're starting something exciting for our Civil War unit." She turned to write on the whiteboard with dramatic flair, "Historical Reenactment Project." A few students perked up at this. History projects usually meant an easy grade if you just showed up in costume. But Michael, a sophomore who'd always earned straight A's in history, noticed Mrs. Wells' eyes flickering towards his corner of the room more than usual. The teacher pulled out a stack of papers, tapping them against her desk to align them perfectly. "This will count for 30% of your final grade," she continued, pacing between the rows of desks. "We'll be recreating several key scenes from the Civil War era to help us better understand this pivotal moment in American history." Students started whispering among themselves, some excited, others groaning about the workload. A paper airplane sailed across the room, making a few kids snicker. But Michael remained quiet, his pencil now still against his notebook. Mrs. Wells began assigning roles with the enthusiasm of a theater director casting her masterpiece. "David, you'll be playing General Grant. Rebecca, you'll be a Southern belle. Christopher, you're a Union soldier." She moved through the list methodically, each name carrying the weight of historical figures. The classroom chatter continued until Mrs. Wells reached Michael's name. Her voice took on a different tone, almost smug. "Michael, you'll be perfect for the role of a plantation slave. It'll add authenticity to our reenactment." The room fell silent. Even the class clown in the back stopped throwing paper airplanes. Michael felt every eye in the room turn toward him, some with pity, others with discomfort, and a few with morbid curiosity. His chest tightened as he processed what he'd just heard. Next to him, his friend Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while behind him, someone whispered, "That's messed up." The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching out like molasses. Michael's mind raced through options. Should he speak up now? Wait until after class? Call his parents? The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about a grade anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and standing up against something fundamentally wrong. Mrs. Wells continued as if she'd just assigned someone to play a tree in a school play, shuffling her papers and moving on to discuss costume requirements. But the damage was done. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically, charged with tension and unspoken words. A few students pulled out their phones under their desks, thumbs flying across screens as they texted about what just happened. Others exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. One student in the front row raised her hand to question the assignment, but was quickly shut down by Mrs. Wells' stern look. The rest of the class passed in a blur of voices and tension. Michael barely heard the discussion about project deadlines and grading rubrics. His notebook page remained blank except for those earlier doodles, now looking like abstract representations of his churning thoughts. When the bell finally rang, it felt like both an eternity and a split second had passed. As students began packing up their bags, the usual end-of-class chatter was subdued. Michael remained seated, his hands steady but his mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple class assignment. The final bell hadn't even finished ringing when Michael gathered his courage and approached Mrs. Wells' desk. His classmates filed out slowly, many lingering near the door, pretending to check their phones while actually waiting to see what would happen next. "Mrs. Wells," Michael said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I need to talk to you about this assignment." He stood tall, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, hands gripped tightly around the project outline she handed out. The teacher barely looked up from her computer screen. "What about it?" she asked, her fingers continuing to tap away at the keyboard. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast strange shadows across her face, making her expression even harder to read. "I'm not comfortable with the role you assigned me," Michael explained carefully, choosing each word with precision. "I don't think it's appropriate, and I'd like to request a different part in the reenactment." Mrs. Wells finally stopped typing and looked up, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Michael, this is a historical reenactment. We're aiming for historical accuracy here. Your role is crucial for depicting the reality of that time period." Outside in the hallway, the usual after-school chaos of slamming lockers and loud conversations seemed muffled, as if the whole world was holding its breath. A few students had their phones partially hidden behind textbooks, their camera apps open and recording. "With all due respect," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger, "I don't think singling out the only black student in class to play a slave serves any educational purpose. It's harmful and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "It's wrong." Mrs. Wells' chair squeaked as she leaned back, crossing her arms. "I think you're being oversensitive about this. It's just a school project. Besides," she added, her tone growing sharper, "this accounts for 30% of your final grade. Are you sure you want to make an issue out of this?" The threat in her voice was barely veiled, but Michael stood his ground. Behind him, he could hear whispers from the doorway where his classmates were still watching. Someone muttered, "This is so messed up," while another voice added, "Keep recording." "I'm not being oversensitive," Michael responded, his hands now slightly shaking, but his voice remained firm. "This is about basic respect and proper education. There are many other roles I could play from that time period: soldiers, politicians, abolitionists." "That wouldn't be historically accurate," Mrs. Wells cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "And I don't appreciate you questioning my teaching methods. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never had a student make such a fuss about a simple assignment." Alex, Michael's best friend who had stayed behind, stepped forward from the doorway. "Mrs. Wells, I don't feel comfortable with my role either. Maybe we could all switch parts around." Other students nodded in agreement, some even stepping back into the classroom in solidarity. But Mrs. Wells wasn't having it. She stood up, pushing her chair back with a screech against the floor. "This discussion is over. Either participate in the assignment as given or accept a failing grade. Your choice, Michael." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Michael pulled out his phone, his hands steadier now. "Then I need to call my mom," he said quietly. "Because this isn't right, and she needs to know what's happening." Mrs. Wells' face flushed red. "Are you threatening me?" "No, ma'am," Michael replied calmly. "I'm just doing what's right." He stepped back, scrolling through his contacts while maintaining eye contact with the teacher. Around him, his classmates' phones continued recording, capturing every word of the exchange. The classroom fell silent except for the sound of Michael's phone dialing. 1 ring. 2 rings. His mother's voice answered, "Hello." "Mom," Michael said, his voice finally cracking slightly. "Something happened at school today. I need your help." Mrs. Wells suddenly seemed less sure of herself, her earlier confidence wavering as she heard the phone conversation begin. She quickly started gathering her things, shoving papers into her briefcase. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, his mother's voice came through clearly in the silent room. "Don't move. Don't sign anything. I'm on my way." As Michael ended the call, he noticed more students had gathered in the doorway. Some were sending text messages, others were posting on social media, and a few were showing their recordings to students from other classes who had stopped to see what was happening. Mrs. Wells hurried toward the door, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor. "This isn't over," she muttered as she pushed past the gathered students. "You're making a big mistake." "No, Mrs. Wells," Michael called after her, his voice carrying down the hallway. The mistake was thinking this would be okay. As the teacher's footsteps faded away, Michael's classmates surrounded him. "We've got it all on video," Alex assured him, showing his phone screen. "Every word." "My sister's on the school paper," another student added. "She's going to want to hear about this." Michael nodded, taking a deep breath. His hands had finally stopped shaking. Looking around at his classmates' supportive faces, he realized that standing up against something wrong wasn't just about being brave. It was about showing others how to be brave too. Now all he had to do was wait for his mother to arrive. And knowing her, this was about to become much bigger than just a history class assignment. This wasn't just about one assignment or one teacher anymore. This was about making sure every student felt safe and respected in their classroom. And Patricia Thompson had no intention of backing down until real change was achieved. She checked her watch and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the dozens of messages from other parents offering support. The local NAACP chapter had already reached out, and several civil rights organizations were standing by. In the background, she could hear the growing buzz of student voices in the courtyard. 28 minutes left. Principal Anderson had better make the right choice, because this was just the beginning. Sometimes it took a single moment, a single brave stand, to spark the kind of change that was long overdue. And as Patricia watched more students and parents arrive, signs in hand and determination in their eyes, she knew that moment had finally come. While Patricia Thompson was meeting with Principal Anderson, something remarkable was happening in the school cafeteria. What started as a small gathering of Michael's classmates had grown into an impromptu student assembly. The usual breakfast chatter had been replaced by passionate discussions about making their school better. Alex stood on a cafeteria chair, waving his hands for attention. "Listen up, everyone." The crowd of students gradually quieted down. "We all saw what happened yesterday in Mrs. Wells' class. But this isn't just about one teacher or one assignment. It's about all of us." The cafeteria was packed, with students sitting on tables and standing against walls. Some held handmade signs, while others were busy making new ones using supplies from the art room. The school's basketball captain Thomas pushed through the crowd to stand beside Alex. "I've got an idea," Thomas announced, his voice carrying across the room. "We're not just going to protest, we're going to show them how history should be taught." He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "I spent all night researching black leaders from the Civil War era. Did you know there were black congressmen, newspaper editors, and military leaders?" A sophomore named Lily raised her hand. "My grandmother's a history professor at the university. She'd probably come talk to our class about this stuff." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic nods. "That's exactly what we need," Alex agreed. "But first, we need to make it clear that none of us will participate in Mrs. Wells' reenactment unless everyone gets fair treatment." He looked around the room. "Who's with us?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hands shot up across the cafeteria, students calling out their support. Even some of the cafeteria staff were nodding in approval, pretending to be busy wiping already clean tables. Near the back of the room, Michael watched in amazement as his classmates organized themselves into committees. One group started drafting a formal letter to the school board. Another began planning a peaceful demonstration for lunch period. A third group worked on creating a social media campaign to spread awareness. "This is incredible," Michael whispered to his friend Kevin, who was updating a spreadsheet of student supporters on his laptop. "What's incredible is that it took this long for someone to stand up," Kevin replied, not looking up from his screen. "But now that you did, nobody's going to sit back down." The school's morning announcements crackled over the intercom, but hardly anyone paid attention. They were too busy planning their response to years of overlooked issues. A freshman girl was sharing stories about subtle discrimination she'd faced in middle school. A senior boy talked about how his younger sister's textbook still used outdated and offensive terms. Suddenly, Ms. Rivera, the Spanish teacher, walked into the cafeteria. Everyone fell silent, worried they'd be told to disperse. Instead, she looked around the room and smiled. "I can't officially support what you're doing," she said carefully, "but hypothetically, if students wanted to organize a peaceful demonstration, they would need to fill out these forms." She placed a stack of papers on a nearby table. "And they would need a faculty advisor to supervise any after-school meetings." She adjusted her glasses and added, "Hypothetically speaking, of course." Then she walked out, leaving behind not just the forms, but also a clear message of support. The energy in the room shifted from passionate chaos to focused determination. Students lined up to sign the forms, while others started a group chat to coordinate their efforts. The school newspaper's editor was already typing up a front-page story on her phone. Outside, more parents were arriving, having heard about the situation from their children's texts and social media posts. They gathered in the parking lot, many still in work clothes or uniforms, holding their own signs of support. A group of seniors used their free period to create an online petition demanding a review of the school's curriculum. Within hours, it had signatures from current students, alumni, and community members from across the city. "We should also think about the future," suggested a junior named Rachel. "Like, what happens after Mrs. Wells? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Her question sparked a new round of discussions. Students began drafting proposals for a student-led diversity committee that would work with teachers to review lesson plans. Others suggested creating an anonymous reporting system for students who faced discrimination. The bell rang for first period, but nobody moved. This felt more important than any regular class. Principal Anderson's voice came over the intercom, requesting all students return to their classrooms, but the cafeteria remained full. "If we leave now, nothing changes," Thomas said, standing on a chair again. "Who's willing to stay until they hear us out?" The response was unanimous. Students pulled out their books, determined to keep up with their studies while taking a stand. Some teachers, seeing what was happening, quietly brought their classes to the cafeteria to join the peaceful protest. As Michael looked around at all the faces, friends and strangers alike, who had come together to support not just him, but the principle of equality itself, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Real change wasn't just possible, it was happening right here, right now, in a high school cafeteria on an ordinary Thursday morning. And this was only the beginning. By lunchtime, the scene outside Riverside High had transformed completely. 3 local news vans were parked in the visitors' lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters in blazers stood in front of cameras, gesturing toward the growing crowd of students and parents behind them. "We'll live at Riverside High School," announced Channel 7's veteran reporter Lisa Chen, where students have organized a peaceful protest against what they describe as discriminatory teaching practices. The camera panned across the school's brick facade, where students had hung a banner reading "Education should unite, not divide." Inside the school's main office, phones rang constantly. The secretary struggled to keep up with calls from parents, community leaders, and even national news outlets. Principal Anderson's email inbox filled faster than he could read them, each message adding to the pressure for immediate action. "Did you see this?" Kevin asked, showing Michael his phone. Someone had uploaded the video of Mrs. Wells' confrontation with Michael, and it had already reached hundreds of thousands of views. The comments section overflowed with support, with many people sharing similar experiences from their own school days. A local radio station was interviewing students during their lunch break. "It's not just about one incident," Thomas explained into the microphone, his voice clear and confident. "We found out Mrs. Wells has a history of this behavior at her previous school. Someone just had to be brave enough to stand up." The reporter nodded, scribbling in her notebook. "And what made this time different?" "Because this time," Thomas continued, "we're not letting it slide. We're not accepting excuses. And we're not alone." He was right. Throughout the morning, support had poured in from unexpected places. The State Teachers Union released a statement condemning discriminatory practices in education. Civil rights organizations offered legal support. Other schools in the district planned solidarity events. Mrs. Wells' past started coming to light as former students shared their stories. A graduate from her previous school posted about similar incidents from 5 years ago. Another former student revealed how she'd left that school after parents complained about her biased teaching methods. "Look at this," Alex said, showing everyone his tablet. The local newspaper had published an article titled "History of Bias: A Teacher's Troubled Past." The story detailed complaints from Mrs. Wells' previous position, including inappropriate comments and unfair treatment of minority students. The superintendent's office finally broke their silence around 2 p.m. A spokesperson stepped out of a black SUV, surrounded by reporters with microphones and cameras. "The district takes these allegations very seriously," she announced, reading from a prepared statement. "We are launching a full investigation into the incident and reviewing our cultural sensitivity policies across all schools." But the students weren't satisfied with vague promises. During 6th period, the school's Wi-Fi network suddenly displayed an unusual amount of activity. Someone had created an online archive of student testimonies about discrimination they'd faced at school. The stories weren't just about Mrs. Wells, they revealed a deeper pattern that needed addressing. Local community leaders began arriving as the afternoon wore on. Reverend Johnson from the First Baptist Church brought coffee and sandwiches for the protesters. City Council member Rodriguez showed up to express solidarity. Even the mayor's office called, requesting a meeting with student representatives. Social media exploded with support. #RiversideStons and #TeachTruthfully became trending topics. Other schools posted messages of support, with some students organizing their own discussions about discrimination in education. The most powerful moment came when a group of Riverside High alumni, some who had graduated decades ago, formed a line in front of the school. Each held a sign sharing the year they graduated and their own experiences with discrimination. "This isn't just about today," said a gray-haired woman who'd graduated in 1975. "This is about making sure tomorrow is better than yesterday." Parents who couldn't leave work sent food deliveries to the protesters. Local businesses displayed supportive messages on their signs. The owner of the nearby print shop donated materials for making more posters. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the school grounds, Michael stood with his mother watching the scene unfold. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing the peaceful but determined crowd. "I never expected all this," Michael said quietly. His mother squeezed his shoulder. "Sometimes it takes one person to help everyone else find their voice." A breaking news alert flashed across everyone's phones. The school board had called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. The superintendent would be there. So would representatives from the State Department of Education. "They can't ignore us now," Alex said, reading the notice. "Change is coming, whether they're ready or not." As reporters packed up their equipment for the evening news broadcasts, students gathered one last time in the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had accomplished something remarkable. They had shown that when people stand together against injustice, their voices become too loud to ignore. The story had grown beyond one teacher, one student, or one school. It had become a catalyst for conversations happening in living rooms, classrooms, and newsrooms across the country. And it all started because one student had the courage to say no. The school board meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., but by 6:30, the parking lot was already filling up. Students, parents, and community members formed a line that wrapped around the building twice. The morning air was crisp, and people passed around coffee cups and breakfast sandwiches as they waited. Inside the meeting room, every seat was taken. The overflow crowd stood along the walls and spilled into the hallway. Local news cameras set up in the back, their red lights blinking steadily. The board members sat at their usual table, but today they looked uncomfortable under the weight of so many watchful eyes. "I've never seen it this full," whispered an elderly janitor to Michael's mother, "not even during budget cuts last year." The superintendent, Dr. Harris, called the meeting to order. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation at Riverside High." "With all due respect," Patricia Thompson interrupted, standing up, "we're not here to hear acknowledgments. We're here for action." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, people stepped up to the microphone. A sophomore described how Mrs. Wells had made inappropriate comments about his heritage. A parent shared how her daughter came home crying after being singled out in class. A retired teacher spoke about witnessing similar incidents but being afraid to speak up. The most powerful testimony came from a former student of Mrs. Wells' previous school. "I graduated 5 years ago," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "What happened to Michael happened to me too. I reported it, but nothing changed. How many more students have to go through this before you do something?" The board members exchanged glances. The evidence was overwhelming. Videos from Michael's classmates played on the projector screen, showing Mrs. Wells' dismissive attitude and threats about grades. Documents from her personnel file revealed a pattern of complaints that had been quietly swept aside. During a brief recess, students gathered in small groups, reviewing their proposals. They had spent hours researching other schools' diversity policies and developing concrete suggestions for change. This wasn't just about removing one teacher. It was about fixing a broken system. When the meeting resumed, Thomas stepped up to present their recommendations. He spoke clearly and confidently, laying out a comprehensive plan that included mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, a student-faculty diversity committee to review curriculum, an anonymous reporting system for discrimination, regular audits of teaching materials and methods, partnerships with cultural organizations for educational programs. These aren't just ideas, Thomas concluded. These are necessities if you want to call yourself a place of learning. The superintendent wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. The pressure was visible on his face. National news outlets were covering the story now. The state education department had sent representatives. Even the governor's office had called asking for updates. Finally, after 4 hours of testimonies and deliberation, Dr. Harris stood up. The room fell silent. Effective immediately, he announced, Mrs. Wells will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. He paused as applause broke out, then continued. But that's just the beginning. We're establishing a task force to implement the students' proposed changes. We're reviewing all our policies and procedures, and we're bringing in external experts to help us do better. Principal Anderson, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, suddenly spoke up. I want to apologize, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I should have acted sooner. But I promise you this, Riverside High will become an example of how schools should handle diversity and inclusion. The crowd's reaction was mixed, relief that action was finally being taken, but determination to ensure these weren't empty promises. Parents began signing up for committee positions. Teachers offered to help develop new curriculum guidelines. Community leaders pledged their support and resources. As people filed out of the meeting room, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. The local news reporter summed it up in her evening broadcast. Today, we saw how a single act of courage, supported by a united community, can create real change. Michael stood with his friends near the exit, watching people leave. Some were crying, others were hugging, and many were already planning their next steps. His mother was deep in conversation with other parents about forming a monitoring committee to ensure the promised changes were implemented. You know what's amazing? Alex said, scrolling through messages on his phone. Other schools are contacting us. They want to know how to start their own diversity committees. This is spreading. Outside, the sun had climbed high in the sky, and the morning chill had given way to warmth. Students who had missed class to attend the meeting weren't worried about absences. Some things were more important than perfect attendance. As Michael walked to his mother's car, a young student he didn't know stopped him. Thank you, she said quietly, for showing us that we don't have to accept things the way they are. Michael smiled, remembering how scared he'd been just days ago. Thank you for standing with me, he replied. That's what made the difference. The school board meeting had lasted only one morning, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage and the willingness of others to stand up and say, enough. The day ended with a community forum, now a monthly tradition at Riverside. Parents, teachers, students, and community members gathered to discuss progress and plan future initiatives. Tonight's topic was expanding the school's mentorship program to help other schools develop their own diversity councils. As Michael headed home, he passed by room 203 one last time. Where Mrs. Wells' desk had once stood, there was now a wall of photographs showing different moments from the past 3 months. Students at the school board meeting, the first diversity council session, community workshops, celebration events. His mother had told him something important during the height of the controversy. Change isn't just about fixing what's wrong, it's about creating something better. Looking at the photos, Michael realized that's exactly what they had done. The sun was setting behind the school building, casting long shadows across the front lawn where students had protested just months ago. But now, instead of protest signs, there were garden beds full of blooming flowers, each one planted by a different student group working together. This wasn't just a happy ending to a difficult situation. It was a new beginning, proof that when people stand up for what's right and work together for change, anything is possible. The transformation of Riverside High wasn't just about one incident or one person, it was about an entire community learning to build a better future, one day at a time.